There's a photograph I cannot stop thinking about. It was taken sometime in the 1840s. In a modest parlor in rural England, a mother sits in a wooden chair, her posture stiff, her eyes fixed at something just above the camera. Beside her, propped against the arm of the chair, is a small child. The child's eyes are open. The child's hands are folded neatly in their lap. The child is wearing a white dress, freshly pressed. The child has been dead for 2 days. The photographer has positioned the body carefully. Iron stands hidden beneath the clothing to hold the torso upright, the eyelids coaxed open with small mechanisms, the jaw set in an expression that almost resembles peace. The mother insisted on this. The mother paid for this, because this photograph, taken of her dead child, was the only image she would ever have of her child at all. This practice was called post-mortem photography, and when I first encountered it, I assumed it was a macabre curiosity, a Victorian oddity, something that could be explained, filed away, and forgotten. Then I noticed something about the children in these photographs. Many of them did not appear to be dead. Let me be careful here. I am not suggesting anything supernatural. I am not suggesting any kind of deception in the conventional sense. I am suggesting something far more quietly disturbing, a gap in our understanding of a practice that was far more widespread, far more institutionally organized, and far more emotionally complex than photographic history has ever fully accounted for. The Victorians photographed their dead. This much is documented, accepted, and often discussed in cultural histories of both photography and grief. What is rarely discussed is the inverse question: what happened when the photograph came first? There is a collection housed in a research archive in Vienna, the provenance of which I will return to, containing approximately 240 daguerreotypes and early albumen prints. The collection was assembled between roughly 1851 and 1889. It was catalogued in the 1970s as a straightforward archive of Victorian memorial photography. Routine, in other words, melancholy but routine, except that a researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Hartle, working in the archive in 1988, noticed something that had apparently been visible the entire time, to anyone who cared to look closely enough. In 43 of the photographs, the children depicted show no signs of post-mortem staging, no iron posture supports, no evidence of the slight bloating or pallor that accompanies even carefully prepared bodies in the hours after death, no evidence of any of the subtle asymmetries that photographers of the era were trained to conceal. These children appeared simply to be sleeping. More troublingly, they appeared to be alive. Hartle spent 3 years attempting to trace the origins of these 43 images. She published a short paper in an Austrian cultural history journal in 1991, in which she described her findings with admirable restraint. She noted that she could not conclusively prove anything. She noted that the documentation accompanying these particular photographs was significantly thinner than the rest of the collection. She noted that in 11 of the cases, she could find no corresponding burial record in any parish register within a 60-mile radius of the address listed on the photograph. No burial records for children who had supposedly just died. Hartle's paper received 3 citations. It was never translated into English. Now, a reasonable person might stop me here, and I think that person would be right too. Burial records from rural Austria in the 1860s are notoriously incomplete. Parish registers were inconsistently maintained. Infant mortality was catastrophically high, and the bureaucratic infrastructure for tracking deaths was rudimentary at best. The absence of a record does not mean the absence of a death. This is a mainstream explanation, and it is not irrational. But here is what troubled me when I kept returning to Hartle's paper. She wasn't looking for missing burial records. She found them incidentally while searching for something else entirely. She was trying to identify the families in the photographs, to give names to the dead children she was cataloging. And when she could not find the names in any surrounding record, not in death registers, not in birth registers, not in church baptism records, she noted the gaps and moved on. She did not make the claim I am about to make. I am making it. What if some of these children never died? Let me explain what I mean by that carefully, because the implications are not what you might immediately assume. I am not suggesting the photographs were fabricated. They are clearly, demonstrably, genuine photographs of real children. The children in these images existed. They were photographed. They were dressed in white, posed in chairs, arranged beside grieving-looking adults. What I am asking is whether, in some cases, the grief was a fabrication. To understand why this possibility is even worth considering, you need to understand the social and economic landscape of childhood in mid-Victorian Europe. Child mortality was not simply a tragedy. It was, for many families, a financial event. The death of a child, particularly an infant, triggered specific social rituals, institutional responses, and in many cases, tangible economic relief. In certain parishes in England and Germany, the death of a child under the age of 5 exempted a family from specific poorhouse obligations for a period of 1 to 3 years. In wealthier families, life insurance policies taken out on children, a practice that became extraordinarily common between 1850 and 1880, paid out sums that could represent several months of a laborer's wages. This is documented. This is not disputed by historians. What is less often discussed is the photographic infrastructure that grew up around a ritual of childhood death. By 1860, memorial photography of dead children had become a formalized industry in most of Western Europe and the northeastern United States. Studios advertised specifically for this work. Photographers trained specifically in these techniques. And crucially, a post-mortem photograph became, in many communities, a kind of social credential, proof that a child had lived, proof that a child had died, proof that a family had grieved properly. The photograph, in other words, was a document, and documents can be created. I want to be precise about what the historical record actually shows. There are at least 6 documented cases in England between 1851 and 1903, prosecuted in various local courts, written about in contemporary newspapers, in which families were found to have falsely reported the death of a child for insurance purposes. In 4 of these cases, memorial photographs were produced as evidence. In 3 of those 4, questions were raised during proceedings about the authenticity of the photographs. In one case, the 1887 inquest in Shropshire involving a family named Pember, a photographer named William Ashton testified that he had been paid to take a photograph of a living child posed in the manner of a dead one. Ashton, who was apparently suffering a crisis of conscience, produced this testimony voluntarily. His account was recorded in the inquest proceedings, which are held in the Shropshire archives. The child in the Pember photograph survived. The child was traced, living 20 years later, in a different county under a different name. The mother had been paid insurance on the child's supposed death. Now, I kept returning to this case because it is so specific, so documented, so verifiable, and so completely absent from any major history of Victorian photography I have ever encountered. Maybe these are isolated incidents. Maybe I am forcing a pattern out a handful of documented frauds and an Austrian researcher's unfinished paper and a collection of photographs that could be explained by simply poor record keeping. Maybe, but then I began looking at the graves. There's a category of structure in Victorian cemeteries that genealogists sometimes call angel graves. Small stone markers, usually top of a carved cherub or small winged figure, erected over plots recorded as containing children under the age of 3. These are among the most emotionally arresting objects in any Victorian cemetery. They appear in enormous numbers. The sheer volume of them tells you something real and devastating about child mortality rates. But some of them are wrong, not subtly wrong. Specifically, demonstrably, administratively wrong. Beginning in the 1870s, civil registration of births and deaths became compulsory in England and Wales. The records from this period are relatively complete, cross-referenced, and accessible. And when genealogical researchers began digitizing and cross-referencing these records in the 1990s and 2000s, something quietly uncomfortable emerged. In certain clusters, geographically specific, temporally specific, there are graves that do not correspond to death certificates. There are death certificates that do not correspond to birth certificates. There are children on census records who appear in one year and disappear in the next without any corresponding death record, only a small stone marker in a churchyard. This by itself is not unusual. It is, again, the expected result of imperfect record keeping. What makes certain clusters unusual is the pattern of what comes after the disappearance. A researcher at the University of Leicester working on an entirely unrelated project about Victorian migration patterns. Notice in 2003 that in a specific cluster of parishes in the East Midlands, a statistically anomalous number of young children appeared in census records under new names, in new households, in the years immediately following recorded deaths in other households. He published a footnote about it. A footnote. The explanation he offered was straightforward. Informal adoption was common in the Victorian era. Children were regularly moved between households without documentation. A child who died in one family's records might simply be a child who was moved and registered under a different name in another family's records. This is entirely plausible. This explanation is almost certainly correct for many of these cases. But the researcher noted in his footnote that the cluster he identified was geographically concentrated in a way that suggested something more organized than random informal adoption. The same parishes, the same decades, the same approximate age ranges. He called it a coincidence of record-keeping failure and social practice. I kept this footnote in my notes for a long time. There's a folklore figure that appears across multiple Northern European cultures, English, German, Scandinavian, Dutch, which scholars of mythology describe under various names, but which shares a consistent set of features. The figure is a child who has been replaced. Not a ghost, not a spirit, something more specific. A living child who occupies a space that was officially vacated, who wears, in some versions of the story, the clothes of a dead sibling, who is known, in the English tradition, by a term that has largely fallen out of use, the changeling. Now, the changeling myth is almost universally interpreted as a folk explanation for developmental disabilities. A child who seemed to change, who behaved differently, who was difficult or strange. Folklore attributed this to supernatural substitution. The real child had been taken, a false child left in its place. I am not saying the changeling myth is a literal memory of insurance fraud, but I kept thinking about the structure of the belief, the specificity of it. A child who appears where a child has disappeared. A child whose origins cannot quite be explained. A child who might be, in the eyes of community, both real and somehow wrong. What if folklore sometimes preserved, in distorted form, the emotional residue of something people had witnessed but could not directly name? Not a supernatural substitution, a bureaucratic one. I want to return to those graves, because the graves are perhaps the most haunting part of all of this, and I have not yet said the most important thing about them. In the documented cases, the Pember case, and the others like it, what happened to the grave? Nothing. The grave remained. In the Pember case, even after the fraud was exposed, even after the child was found living in another county, the small stone marker in the churchyard was not removed. It remained there, inscribed with a name and a date and the words "beloved child," for as long as anyone recorded checking. A grave for someone who had not died, a memorial for someone who was alive. And I found myself wondering how many such stones are still standing. In churchyards across England and Germany and Austria and the northeastern United States. In all those cemeteries full of small carved angels, how many of those markers are for children who grew up somewhere else, under different names, entirely unaware that somewhere, cut into stone, their death had been recorded? The grave does not know it is wrong. The grave simply stands. I should say again that I am not making a sweeping claim. The vast majority of those angel graves mark real deaths. The Victorian child mortality rate was a genuine catastrophe that shaped the psychology and culture of an entire civilization. I am not diminishing that grief or questioning that history. I am asking a narrow, specific, deeply uncomfortable question about the edges of that history. What institutional systems made certain kinds of deception possible? What photographic practices participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in those systems? And what does it mean that the evidence, where it exists, has largely remained in footnotes, in untranslated Austrian journal articles, in inquest records nobody has digitized? Not because anyone suppressed it, but perhaps because no one was looking. The photograph of the sleeping child, that is where I keep returning, in the Hartl collection in Vienna. In those 43 photographs where the children appear simply to be sleeping, there's one image that I find myself thinking about more than the others. It shows a girl, perhaps 3 years old. She is lying on a small settee, her eyes closed, her hair arranged carefully across a white pillow. Her hands are at her sides. The photograph is exceptionally well composed, which suggests a photographer some skill. At the edge of the frame, almost cropped out, there is a woman's hand. It rests near the child's shoulder, not quite touching. The hand is slightly blurred. Motion blur. In a photograph of a dead child, there should be no motion blur. The dead do not move. The photographers of this era used long exposures precisely because their subjects were still. The hand in this photograph moved during the exposure. Someone, whoever that hand belongs to, was struggling to hold still. The obvious explanation is that the accompanying adult simply moved. That grief made stillness impossible. That the blur means only what appears to mean. A grieving parent, trembling, photographed beside their dead child. This may be correct, but I kept thinking about what the blur would also mean if the child were alive, if the child were asleep or sedated, or simply asked to remain very still. The attending adult would need to be careful not to wake them, not to startle them. And the terrible patient effort of pretending to grieve beside a living child, might cause a hand to tremble, might cause a hand to blur. I don't have answers, only questions. And once you begin to see the outlines of this question, you start to see it echo in other places. The practice of post-mortem photography in the United States, particularly in the South and Midwest between 1860 and 1900, has been studied extensively. What has been studied less is the role of photography studios in communities with high rates of what historians call informal child placement. The moving of children between households without legal documentation, often across state lines, often following economic disruption, the same decades, the same approximate geography, the same institutional invisibility, and a question that nobody has quite asked directly. In a world where a photograph could prove a death, what happened in the communities where photographers were willing to take that photograph before the death occurred? I want to end with something I cannot resolve. In the summer of 1892, a photographer in Cincinnati named Jerome Alderman placed an advertisement in a local paper. The advertisement offered what he called complete memorial services for grieving families, including, in his words, arrangement for those whose circumstances require discretion. The advertisement ran twice. Then it disappeared from the papers. Alderman's studio closed in 1893. His records, like so many records of this era, did not survive. What those discretion arrangements actually were, I cannot tell you. Whether they were innocent or not, I cannot tell you. Whether the children photographed in the studio went on to live ordinary lives somewhere else, or whether they were simply dead and photographed gently, I cannot tell you. But somewhere in Cincinnati in the 1890s, in a city full of small graves, Jerome Alderman was offering something to families in difficult circumstances, something that required discretion, something that left very little trace. The graves are still there. Some of them have names on them. And somewhere in a record I cannot find, or a photograph I have not yet seen, or a footnote in a journal nobody has translated, there may be the answer to the question I cannot stop asking, whether the children in those graves were ever really gone, or whether they simply had to disappear quietly on paper in a photograph so that someone else could go on living. The stone does not answer. The stone only remembers the date.